Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is part of our Sure Writing Retreat here in August 2021, and this session is on reducing wordiness. And with us, we have Jill McMillan, who is the Graduate Writing Specialist over at the University of Saskatchewan Library. And if you're wondering who this voice is, I'm Merle Massey. I'm the Coordinator of Undergraduate Research at the University of Saskatchewan. Jill, with that, over to you. Teach us how to reduce wordiness.
Okay, I will try my best. So this 30-minute style spotlight is on the topic of reducing wordiness, something that I will fully admit I grapple with because my natural tendency when expressing myself is to be a little bit wordy. But let's look at how we can start putting some tips into action from the very start of today's session. So here we have quite a long sentence. My question to you is, how might you rephrase this sentence? Feel free to contribute in the chat. It currently reads as follows. In academia, it is common to encounter convoluted, overwrought, needlessly complicated, or obscure language when a few common words would express the same idea clearly, concisely, and simply to the intended readers. Let's take 2 or 3 minutes. How would you rephrase this sentence? We have some great recommendations already coming through the chat, some reducing it to 2 words rather humorously, others focusing on how you can simply remove some of the synonyms, others focusing on how you might actually modify the sentence in a more unique way. And what's great about seeing how people are approaching this sort of exercise is that we see that, as with so much writing, we have a lot of choice available to us. And so you could revise this in a number of ways that's going to reflect your own style as a communicator. I would rephrase it as follows, but again, this is just my style. Academics often use overly complicated or wordy language when simpler or fewer words would do. Visually, already we can see this is probably less than 50% of the length of that original. And the purpose of this exercise, of course, is to poke fun at some of the habits we see in academic writing, which is a type of communication where we often see a tendency towards wordiness, toward complication, when in actuality things could be expressed a lot more simply. So just kicking off today's session with a sort of a knowing wink at the writing context in which we operate. So why should we care? I mean, we're communicating the exact same thing in that original and that revised version. So the meaning is actually is comparable. But wordiness becomes an issue when we are thinking about who our reader is. And if things are too wordy, it can make it more complicated or difficult to grab and hold a reader's attention. And especially given that readers often have many, many different things competing for attention, we want to ensure that our communication is going to connect with them immediately and hold them throughout the duration of our text. Again, from a reader's perspective, if things are too wordy, it can be a little bit boring or even frustrating when reading, especially if it starts to interfere with or impede comprehension. That's when it actually becomes a major concern. It becomes even less about a style issue and more about a readability and comprehension issue. And another reason why we might be concerned about wordiness is that, especially if we are writing in contexts where we have very limited word counts, then it can be difficult to maximize the number of words that we have available to us as writers. So if we are able to adopt a practice where we're more mindful about eliminating wordiness, then we can actually share more information in a still limited space. So we can create ultimately a stronger product if we have those really restricted word counts. So I'd like to just share this quote from someone who writes for the APA Style blog. Scholarly writing requires clear communication. Wordiness hurts communication because it forces readers to disentangle the useful parts of the writing from the unnecessary parts, which can slow down or even impede readers' understanding. And that sort of is at the heart of why we care about wordiness in our written communication. So fortunately, we have multiple strategies that we can make use of when we want to reduce wordiness. So we can be very intentional in addressing this in our writing if this is something that we know is a characteristic of how we are presenting our documents. So our strategies include avoiding nominalization, removing qualifiers, combining sentences, and eliminating redundancies. And we already saw a trend in how many of you approached that opening activity where we saw some of those redundancies being eliminated. So I think we're already have a lot of insight in tackling that or making use of that fourth strategy. But let's look at strategy 1. This is all about reducing nominalization. If you're not familiar with this term, no worries. It's something that you may or may not be familiar with, but basically it refers to nouns that were created from adjectives or verbs. This speaks to the plasticity of the English language, the flexibility of the English language. But what happens is that these nouns become a little bit zombified. I have not invented this term. This term, I believe, was invented by Helen Sword. And she argues that these nouns sort of walk around without any purpose, without any consciousness. And it's because they lack the strength that they originally had in an adjective or verb form. So some of the common nominalizations that we encounter in academia include words like difficulty, applicability, intensity, assumption, intervention, investigation. I know I've certainly used all of those in my writing multiple times, but we have adjectives and verbs that actually communicate the same thing, even in a slightly stronger way. So difficulty comes from difficult, applicability comes from applicable, intensity comes from intense. Likewise, assumption comes from assume, intervention comes from intervene, and lastly, investigation comes from investigate. Now, it's not that nominalization doesn't have a place, like so much of the English language. Certain choices have purpose in certain contexts. So if you are referring to a previous sentence, especially if you are incorporating elements of the old new information technique that can really establish some nice flow in your writing, then that degree of nominalization can actually be very purposeful. So for instance, writing these possibilities or these findings, that is an example of nominalization, but it's helping to link to the previous sentence, so it still has a nice functionality. Nominalization is also very beneficial when communicating more abstract ideas and concepts such as discovery, revolution. It'd be very complicated to take those nominalized terms and change them. It would result in more explanation than would be beneficial to your reader. So sometimes nominalization is completely fine, even beneficial. But if you have too many in your writing, it can start to weigh down the language, just make it a bit tired and stodgy, and ultimately too wordy. So fortunately, there is actually a very simple solution for combating nominalization, where we take that nominalized noun and replace it with a strong active verb if it's going to make sense for the sentence. So here we have an example of nominalization in a sentence. And my question to you, how can you actually rephrase this sentence? The hint is that the nominalized words have been highlighted. So how might you transform those nominalized words into a sentence that prioritizes strong active verbs? So currently it reads as follows: this paper provides an analysis of the problem of sampling bias and offers a solution. How could you rephrase this to remove that nominalization? Let's take 2 or 3 minutes and contribute in the chat. One really good suggestion in the chat already. So rephrasing as this paper analyzes the problem of sampling bias and solves it. That works really well. Let's just wait another 30 seconds in case anyone else is typing something up, and then we'll look at another way in which this sentence can be rephrased. So just in the keeping our time in mind, here we have very similar to the suggestion that was raised in the chat earlier, but even a little bit shorter. So the paper analyzes and solves the problem of sampling bias. So what we've done is, in combating the nominalization, we've had to restructure where some of the information fits in the sentence. So it's not as simple as just replacing individual words. So that's something to keep in mind when taking on this issue in our writing. Now, one of the reasons why nominalization, zombie nouns, can lead to wordiness is because it's often accompanied by what we might refer to as waste words. So words such as it, this, that, there. And this can contribute to sentences being overly wordy. Again, none of those words in and of themselves are terrible words. They have a lot of purpose in writing, but if they're appearing and they don't need to appear, it's going to contribute to that wordiness. So for instance, in this sentence, it can be observed that there are many words, but that very little gets said. So it's just a sentence filled with waste words. We could easily revise that to very little is said in this sentence, reducing it by more than 50%. So we're getting to the point much more quickly. We're keeping our reader a little bit more engaged so that they can focus on the content that you're sharing rather than getting bogged down in the language. So let's take a few minutes to revise this paragraph in order to try and make the information a little bit more concise with the intent through the removal or the replacement of those nominalized terms. So let's take 3 or 4 minutes to work on this activity before we move on to our next strategy. I have some suggestions coming up. Sorry, if you hear beeping in the background, my cat has found one of her interactive toys. And okay. So, and it's totally okay if this was a challenging exercise, because some of this writing that we're encountering, it actually seems conventional to us because it echoes a lot of what we see in academic contexts, but we can really try and think about why things are being phrased the way that they are. So here we have a revised paragraph where nearly 20 words have been removed. So really just honing in on those nominalized nouns and figuring out, can this be changed into a nice strong verb instead? And sometimes that then leads to cutting other bits of information. So for instance, in that first sentence, if we are focusing on this use of the term visited as opposed to conducted visits, suddenly we get to remove that other verb in favor of foregrounding visit as the main verb in that sentence. So visited, assessed, observed, are, poses, we will know. All of this is helping to reduce some of those words in this previously somewhat wordy paragraph. So reducing nominalizations is one of the best ways in which we can reduce wordiness in our writing. Our second strategy is all about removing qualifiers. And a qualifier is simply a word that we attach to another word in order to create some sort of limit or enhancement. And the common ones that we have in English include definitely, somewhat, quite, fairly, extremely, practically, actually, really, basically, entirely, probably, and very. And in our writing, we often don't need them, especially if their function is fairly weak. And the solution in managing these weaker qualifiers is to simply remove them. And I recognize that in academia, we always want to be mindful of the value of hedging language. Sometimes we need to put those qualifiers in our writing so that we're not criticized for making very strong statements about the research that we're doing in order to demonstrate our awareness of nuance and other factors that might be influencing the results that we're looking at. But some weak qualifiers can just be taken out completely because they're often not contributing anything. So these examples, we found the proposal quite feasible, just remove quite. Likewise, the remark, though surprising, was entirely accurate. And the word entirely is not adding anything. Likewise, in the third example, the scene was extremely typical. Extremely is not contributing anything. Likewise, that behavior is fairly unique. Just it fairly is not really adding anything either. Oh, there's a really good suggestion in the chat, doing a Control F search of ly to find qualifiers and get rid of them. That's a really good recommendation. I'll have to add that the next time I'm doing this presentation. The next strategy is all about combining sentences to see if we have additional sentences that are becoming unnecessary. So what we can do as part of our revision process, we can see, do I have unintentional repetition? Do I have somewhat choppy flow? It might be because those sentences are currently separated in a way where the information would be better if it was combined. So here we have an example. My ask of you is to try and rephrase it into one concise sentence. It reads, Taylor brought some candy back from Europe. It wasn't shaped like American candy. The candy tasted kind of strange to him. I'm highlighting where we have some perhaps unintentional repetition in that sentence. How could you rephrase this to form one concise sentence out of 3? Let's take 2 or 3 minutes, contribute in the chat before we look at our fourth and final strategy. A few suggestions coming in where we start to see how we can make it into one sentence. As someone has noted in the chat, it's just because something can become one sentence doesn't necessarily make it less wordy. So it is that balancing act of combining as well as reducing. So let's just look at another example in addition to the ones that we've seen in the chat. In our revised example, we might write something like Taylor brought some strange tasting candy back from Europe that wasn't shaped like American candy. And so we still have the word candy twice, but we have removed reference to one of the redundant candies. And it's helping to integrate those sentences into one sentence instead. That being said, there's one really good suggestion in the chat that I might want to steal in the future. So Taylor brought European candy that tasted strange and was not shaped like American candy. So actually taking that word Europe, turning it into European, making it a little bit more concise as well. So lots of great options in the chat, and that always speaks to the fun and the art, I think, of revision, because we have a lot of these different choices that are available to us. So thank you for those contributions. Our final strategy is all about eliminating redundancies. And I think this speaks to that difference between how we speak and how we write in English. And in many English-speaking cultures, it's quite common for English speakers to rely on redundancies to create emphasis. So you'll encounter redundancies much more frequently in spoken communication, but when that translates into a written context, it becomes unnecessary and even potentially distracting. And so it's trying to balance how we communicate in those two different mediums and figuring out what's going to work the best in each case. So redundancies can often be identified through the association of prepositional phrases. So any phrases that begin with at, but, for, in, of, on, under. Often these are attached to phrases that might actually turn out to be somewhat redundant. So for example, at present, that little phrase could actually be changed into one word, now. Likewise, under normal circumstances, that could be changed into one word, normally. So here we have some of the common ones that occur in academic writing. So a majority of can become most, a number of can become many, several, or numerous, are known to be can become are, at the same time can become while, in close proximity to can become near, due to the fact that can become because, for the purpose of can become for or to, and lastly, and this is the one that I do pay attention to the most, in order to can become to. I'm not sure if I've ever encountered a context where in order to couldn't become to. So it might be that I still sometimes use those other phrases, but the one that I'm very attuned to is in order to. I try and axe in order to from my writing. And that's just something that I have fixated on. You might have other prepositional phrases that you have focused on and that you are very cognizant of when revising and replacing those with a more direct single word. So let's wrap up by taking on one or both of the following sentences and revise them using what we know about reducing some wordiness, focusing on the removal of redundancies, prepositional phrases. So let's take maybe 2 minutes, just be mindful of time. Choose one, or if you're ambitious, choose both. Contribute in the chat, and then we'll look at each of them to see how they can be rephrased to be less wordy. We have some suggestions coming in for our first example, and two are quite similar. The third one is a little bit different, but again, we're seeing that we can really remove some of these redundancies to make something that is a bit more concise. So let's take a look. So in that original, we see the same word appear frequently. Respiration comes up a lot in that original. In trauma victims, breathing is restored by artificial respiration. Techniques of artificial respiration include mouth-to-mouth respiration and mouth-to-nose respiration. We could revise this by removing those redundancies and simply state, in trauma victims, breathing is restored by artificial respiration, either mouth-to-mouth or mouth-to-nose. Respiration, artificial respiration, only needs to appear once for the content to make sense for readers to understand. And in doing so, we've eliminated some of that needless repetition. And we've also combined those sentences into one sentence. Let's take a look at the next one as we wrap up. So the original reads as follows: for all intents and purposes, American industrial productivity generally depends on certain factors that are really more psychological in kind than of any given technological aspect. Even reading that sentence, I was getting out of breath. It's very jargony. It's very vague. There's a lot of synonyms and redundancies in that example, where we could be a lot more to the point in a revised version. American industrial productivity depends more on psychological than on technological factors. So we've removed those unnecessary modifiers. All right, so we've gone a little bit over time, which I recognize the irony when we're looking at how to reduce wordiness, and yet I seem to talk a lot during this presentation. But thanks so much for joining me, and a reminder as well of the different services and supports that are available at the library. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes, but otherwise, perhaps I'll see you at the next write-in, which happens in about 14 minutes.